Okay friend, it's time to get started on replacing the wheel bearing. To start, obviously we want to raise and support the front of the vehicle so the wheel's off the ground. Okay, now the next thing we're going to do is go ahead and remove the hubcap from this. For that, I'm just going to use a prying device, carefully get in between the wheel and the hubcap, and separate the two. After that, let's remove all 5 of our lug nuts and then the wheel. Okay, now the next thing that we want to do is take a pry bar and we're going to carefully get in between the caliper itself right here and the rotor right inside this area. Essentially when we do that, we're just going to gently pry, push back the caliper a little bit so it has some movement. Perfect. To remove our 2 caliper bracket mounting bolts, those are going to be the larger 2 bolts right here and right there. After that, we'll take the caliper and we'll carefully set it aside. There's 1 bolt. I'm just going to leave it in a few threads here. We'll do the bottom one as well. Now I'm going to hang this so I'm putting no pressure on my flex hose. If your rotor's stuck on like ours is right here, just take one of your lug nuts and start it on. A few good threads there. Take some penetrant, spray it along these areas. Now we're going to use a hammer and we're going to carefully bonk along this area right here. Be very careful not to hit there or even of course along the braking surface. Remove your rotor. Now let's continue on with some penetrant. I'm going to go ahead and spray along where the axle nut is. And then of course along where the bearing connects onto the knuckle and where you can see all the threads from the bolts coming through. Now we can continue on to getting ready to remove our axle nut. You're going to find that you have a cotter pin and a locking clip on here. Go ahead and remove the pair and then we'll remove the nut. To remove the axle nut, what you might happen to find is that this might tend to spin on you. If that's the case, you could take a nice long pry bar, come in between the studs here down to the ground to hold it still. Now let's take a hammer and punch, come right in the center here and break this free. The next thing we need to do is come from the backside here and we're going to remove all 4 of our mounting bolts. You'll find one right here, one up in this corner, and then of course the same on the reverse side. There's one, do the same to the other 3. Last one. Now the next thing we're going to do is get ready to start separating the bearing from the knuckle. Obviously, you want to be very careful for your ABS sensor which comes along the backside there. I'm just going to take this axle nut, we'll start it on there just a couple threads. Next, we'll take the hammer and we're going to give this a couple loving bonks trying to drive it away from the knuckle. As you can tell, it's starting to separate. Now I'll just do the same from the other side a little bit and then we'll continue. Now we'll remove our bearing. Remove the backing plate. There it is, friends. Now with the wheel bearing out of there, the next thing that we need to do is clean up the mating surface. Essentially every place that the bearing touched up against, you want to make sure that it's nice and clean and free of all this debris. You want to be extra careful for your ABS sensor, which is right across here. If you can grab onto the sensor and wiggle it around, then that means that it's damaged. This one feels like it's in perfect condition, so I'll just go ahead and clean up the area. Now that that's nice and cleaned, let's move along to cleaning our bolts that hold everything together. Now you're also going to want to clean up the mating surfaces on your backing plate. You can see that this one has some buildup all along it. You want to make sure that you don't have any flakes or crusties inside here. If you do, obviously that can cause an issue. Let's add some red thread locker to the threads of our mounting bolts here. Okay, now it's going to be time to get ready to install our brand new bearing. Let's make sure that we slide it into the backing plate. Try to line up your holes. And now we're going to insert this onto the knuckle itself. Now when we do this, you want to make sure that you have this cutout right along here, down where your ball joint is. This large cutout right here, where the caliper is going to go. If you have it backwards, you're going to have issues. Now let's torque these to 65 foot-pounds. Once the bearing's mounted and torqued, we're going to continue on with a little bit of copper never seize along the mating surface. Okay, now that we have the bearing mounted, the next thing that we're going to want to do is put the rotor on there. But before we do that, we want to make sure that we clean up all of the mating surface on this so it's nice and smooth. And of course, make sure that we don't have anything on our braking surface as well. Now with the rotor nice and clean, let's go ahead and slide this on here. And now I'm going to start a lug nut on just so it holds the rotor so it doesn't move around on me. Next, we're going to get ready to put our caliper on. Take those two caliper bolts with a little bit of red thread locker. We'll grab the caliper, slide it on, start in both of our bolts, and then we'll torque these to 122 foot-pounds. Now it's time to put on the axle nut. Go ahead and bottom this out. Now the next thing we're going to do is torque this axle nut to 188 foot-pounds. To do that, you're probably going to notice that it wants to spin on you. Just take your bar going carefully across the studs so you don't damage them. That's going to prevent it from spinning, and then you can torque it. Once it's torqued, you want to make sure that you lock it in using your clip right here. I want to make sure that I have these little slots lined up with the hole that's through my axle. Just slide this right on. Make sure it's lined up. Take your cotter pin, slide it right down and through, and then lock it in. Let's go ahead and get this lug nut off of here and get ready to get the wheel on there. Let's go ahead and get this lug nut off of here and then get the wheel and start putting it on. Okay, now we'll just bottom out all the lug nuts in a crisscross manner, and then we'll torque them to 83 foot-pounds. Now with the wheel, so it's just barely touching the ground and it can't spin, let's go ahead and torque them. Now we're going to put on our hubcap. Pay attention to this area right here. That's where the valve stem needs to line up. Go ahead and slide it right on there. Give it a loving bonk. And now let's go pump up the brake. Okay friends, we got the wheel bearing in there. What's left to do now? You're going to take it for a road test. Make sure you don't have any funny noises. And then of course take it down to your local alignment shop.